Okay, hello. We are here. It is the new season of House of the Dragon. I had talked a little bit about this in my preseason podcast video sort of thing that the week of the first in the aftermath of the release of the first episode was going to be an insanely busy one for me. I'm currently traveling, been dealing with quite a lot of obligations that were unforeseen. So, long story short, I am not going to be able to make a full, comprehensive, fully edited breakdown video for this episode. My original plan was to sort of combine episodes one and two and do one like mega high quality breakdown video, but I figured I'd like to just get my thoughts out there on this episode and rather focus the first, hopefully if my schedule permits, full edited traditional video of the season on episode 2, because I have a feeling based on this episode that quite a lot is going to happen in episode 2, so I wanted to give that its own full like video, giving it the attention it deserves. So rather I'd get out some quick thoughts here in a sort of podcast free form, just discussion off the cuff format, rather than my traditional fully edited breakdown videos. So there's a lot going on in this episode, but I kind of wanted to focus on the issues. This was a solid episode. I will get that right out of the way. It was a great season premiere. This was originally, for context, supposed to be episode 9 of last season. And I think if you watch the episode in that context and thinking that way, it makes a lot of sense. This feels like an episode niner for a traditional Game of Thrones universe season. It has that pacing. There was some stuff in the beginning that sort of just reestablishes everything that's going on and like where all the characters are at for the season, but it definitely felt like this was the second to last episode of the previous season. So guessing next week's episode will feel like a season finale more than a second episode of the season, and then season episode 3 will probably be jumping into what was planned to be the season 3 content to begin with. So the whole pacing for this show is screwed up, but that's not here really what I want to talk about today. I just wanted to give that contextual background there. I had talked in my preseason podcast video thing about the George R. R. Martin toxic butterfly situation, where essentially he was very upset with the showrunners for changing and removing certain things that could cause issues later. Now, at the time, I thought he was overreacting slightly. I understand the sensitivity around your own story and your own material when it's being adapted. I completely get that and sympathize with him in that sense. But I think the things he chose to fixate on and react to were a little odd for how minor they were, especially now, knowing what was to come later in this episode, particularly. So I'm wondering if was almost, he had found out about what they were doing in this episode and was furious about that he went back and just he couldn't explain that at the time, because it was spitting spoilers, so he was just kind of fixating on little things. I think that's probably what was happening, to be quite honest, if I had to guess. But anyway, long story short, George and the showrunner Ryan Condal are not on speaking terms anymore, and George is not involved in the writers' room for the show or the creative team for the show in any capacity. So it's sad, but it is the situation that we're getting. I think that for all of the harm he's done, Ryan Condal definitely does. Up until this episode, I definitely thought that Ryan Condal really cared about this story and giving it the justice it deserves. And I would still say he does. I think he just has misunderstandings of what's important to the story, which I think is more of an interpretation issue rather than a solid, like, not caring about the story issue, if that makes sense. So I think there are situations that happened in this episode, and I will not be giving any spoilers. I should caveat that I will not be giving any spoilers for what's to come in this book. But there are situations in this episode, things that either happened or didn't happen, that put the show in a very weird situation because certain pieces of the puzzle needed to move in this episode for the rest of the story to play out as it does. And I'm very confused as to why they chose to change those things. So I think, namely, I'm going to start with the removal of a certain contextual situation in this episode, and that is the essential whole reason behind the intensity of the Battle of the Gullet. Sure, the Triarchy was going to come in and try to break down the Black Faction blockade. That was planned, that was happening. But the real heavy weight of this situation is the fact that Rhaenyra's two youngest children, Aegon and Viserys, not to be confused, I think that's why they're like snuffing Aegon, because he has the same name, but the book calls him Aegon the Younger, so to make that distinction. So it's Aegon the Younger and Viserys, her two youngest children, are being escorted to safety across the Narrow Sea over in Essos, which is the continent east of Westeros. And so the whole real intensity behind the battle stems from the fact that the Triarchy forces, who are under the Green faction, of course, come across this ship and are able to kidnap her youngest child, Viserys. And that's a huge, and Lohar is actually, I believe, the one to do this, if I remember correctly from the book. So I think it's a huge deviation, especially since we got Lohar's death in this episode. So it's not like next episode she could stumble upon him. And also, Rhaenyra would have referenced that in dialogue that she was having her kids escorted, or that would have been shown. Like, this is something that they just showed to deliberately change, and I don't know why, because that sets up a huge domino effect for the rest of the story. Like, that's a huge piece of the narrative shift in this book, and now that just didn't happen. And it also adds a lot of emotional weight, because in the book, it's not Rhaenyra being trapped against her will while Jace goes and does something. Like, she actively sends Jace because it's the lives of her other children at stake. Like, that's a huge difference, and I think it really reshapes the guilt that Rhaenyra is going to feel about this situation. Sure, she's going to feel guilty and horrible, but think about how that changes when you're the one that's okaying something versus it happening against your will. So I really think that does a lot to change Rhaenyra's character, which is very, I don't know, it's a weird choice, I think, to change that contextual situation, especially would have made the situation even more exciting on screen. So I'm really not sure what they're going for here and what they're doing, because that will create a lot of toxic butterfly domino effects for the future of the story. Like, a lot of things can't happen because of that. Very interested. Maybe they'll come up with a new situation in which this happens to Aegon the Younger and Viserys, but why would they do that if they already had one? So I don't know. And I think the other big shift that they made a change of, and I was talking about this in my season video podcast thing, but I didn't want to give too many spoilers, and that is the situation with the character Nettles. So Nettles is a character in the book that is key to the story, in my opinion, and the thematic messaging of the story. And Rhaena is not in this battle. Like, she is off in the Vale doing political machinations. That is what she is doing currently in the story, in the book. And it is actually Nettles who swoops in and fills essentially the role Rhaena filled in this episode. And by shifting that, it makes the situation not make sense. It doesn't really work, especially since, like, Rhaena is a Targaryen that can bond with dragons, like, fully effectively. Like, like, it really makes no sense why this dragon that she seemingly bonded with would not be listening to her and being defying her at every turn. I know people are citing Vhagar and Aemond at the end of episode 1, where he killed Lucerys, even though Aemond said no. But, that's, sure, people are saying that was foreshadowing for this. I don't think it was. I think it's coincidence. But it just feels really weird that they cut this, in my opinion, key character to the story. And Nettles is incredibly important for both Rhaenyra's and Daemon's character arcs in the future. And I feel like her not being here and giving that role to Rhaena really changes the nature of the story in a fundamental way. And Rhaena being like, Niddles is a common born, essentially. You're essentially is made to think she's like homeless or a street rat type person that manages to successfully claim a dragon of her own, and sort of the black faction's like, oh shit. And they get her on her side, but there's a lot of tension there and class commentary there, and it's a huge part of the story of her role in sort of the dynamic between Rhaenyra, Daemon, and her. It's like this very interesting, huge part of the story that I think is being abandoned for no reason. And I guess they wanted to give more screen time to Rhaena and develop her more as a character, but I feel like they could have given her what she was actually doing, and it would have been fine. Like if Rhaena was like over in the Vale making political moves, like in my opinion, that would have been just as interesting. And giving her Rhaena the role of another character for this and cutting that character out completely makes me dislike the character in the show more. So I feel like it almost had the opposite intended effect for me. Now, I'm not going to be commentating on the supposed deaths of Tywin Lannister and Corlys, because we don't see them. So we don't see the deaths happen. So if you don't see the death on screen, if we don't see the body, we saw Lohar's body. That's why I'm convinced, like confirmed, like, Lohar is definitively dead, and that changes the story in a weird way. So I'm able to say that, but we don't see Corlys and Tylan's body. So I'm going to not commentate on that or any implications on that, because I'm not assuming one direction or the other. The show could go either way with those characters, So there's really no way to know yet. But all's to say, I thought the way they handled Jace's death scene was fantastic. I thought it was crushing, like just when things were finally like working out, there's this cacophony of tragedy of errors, and it's sad. It's sad. And think about how if Rhaenyra was at this level of mental state, like that like manic depressive like fluctuation and the sheer frustration and like of her situation just weighing on her, like in this episode, if her mental state was at that before Jace's death, just think about how she's going to be now with Jace's death. And that's another thing in the book, it's even more so because it was Jace's death and the kidnapping of her youngest son by a group aligned with the Green faction in the same swoop. And I think that removing that element is just, it changes the situation. Anyway, I really enjoyed this episode. I thought it was very well made. I loved the Isle of Faces stuff, but it was weird why Adam, Hugh, and Ulf were there at the Isle of Faces, because at the end of the last season, we saw Rhaenyra essentially sending them to go attack Lannisport and Old Town. But I figured that with the conversation with Alicent, she was going to modify her approach and have them help her with the taking of King's Landing. But it seems like the timeline's off. It seems like she already had sent them to the Isle of Faces to wait for Vhagar before finding out from Alicent what was going on. So I'm a little confused about what's going on there. I think it could be a plot hole, but I really don't know. But it was it was Alice Rivers is so fucking funny as usual. She's such a good character. And we saw another Green Man like up close. Like, what are they doing with the Green Man in this show? Like like I'm very curious to where they're going for that. There was like a set leak that I don't want to mention that makes me very intrigued about it, but I don't know if it was a fake set leak or a real set leak, so I'm not even going to entertain it right now. But yeah, I think I am concerned as to where the show is going to go from here, because there are certain plot threads and the way the story progresses cannot happen in the same way any longer because of the plot shifts in this episode. So I'm very curious to see what their idea is here and what they're going for, because they can't really do the same story in the same way anymore as the book. And I know I had talked about how House of the Dragon is more of an interpretive remix of Fire and Blood rather than a direct adaptation, to where they were filling in gaps and where multiple options of what happened in certain situations are proposed to the reader, and it's up to the reader to determine their own interpretation of what happened. The show is making definitive stances on what they think happened between certain events, and they're also extrapolating on when characters are off page and what they're doing in the meantime. And I really like those additions, and I think they work very well, and the show does a lot that's even better than the book in that sense. But this is not that. That's what I kind of want to get solidified. This is not that. This is the changing of key non-interpretable pieces of the story, strict events that happened. Not like, oh, we don't know what happened here. This is things that literally happened on page that we know definitively happened for the story to continue in the way it does in the future are not being done. And that's a problem. That's when I get worried about where the story's going to go. I honestly think back to Game of Thrones, where a lot of people don't realize this. They say, oh, they ran out of the books, so they had to make stuff up for the last few seasons. They didn't. They chose not to adapt books 4 and 5. They took some stray elements from books 4 or 5, which are A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, and they used them in seasons 5 and 6 scatteredly. But they didn't really adapt them. And I think that is where the show's downfall began, because they got themselves into a point to where they had an ending they needed to convey, but they couldn't do it because the things they remove from the story are so pivotal to it. And I'm worried that's going to happen again here. I'm concerned. It's an entirely different team. It's not Dan and Dave, it's Ryan Condal, but I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm gonna keep watching the show and we'll see what happens. I just left this episode pretty concerned. So yeah, those are essentially my quick thoughts here. Just quick freeform off the cuff thoughts. Next week, hopefully, travel and schedule permitting, I will be able to get back to a full in-depth edited breakdown video, but we'll have to see. So yeah, thank you for watching / listening, and even with my concerns, I'm looking forward to diving further into the season with you all. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.